today. We are thrilled to welcome Gary Shteyngart in conversation with Carolyn Kellogg, talking about Gary's new book, Our Country Friends. Gary Shteyngart is a multi-award-winning New York Times bestselling author whose books regularly appear on best of lists around the world and have been published in 30 countries. He is the author of the memoir Little Failure and the novel Super Sad True Love Story, Late Success, Absurdistan, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, as well as the book he'll be talking about today, Our Country Friends. It's March 2020 and a calamity is unfolding. A group of friends and friends of friends gathers in a country house to wait out the pandemic. Over the next 6 months, new relationships and romances take hold while old betrayals emerge, forcing each character to reevaluate whom they love and what matters most. In Our Country Friends, Gary Shteyngart documents through fiction the emotional toll of our recent times in a story of love and friendship that reads like a great Russian novel set in upstate New York. Today, he'll be joined by Carolyn Kellogg, a writer, critic, and former books editor of the Los Angeles Times. Today's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone else has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, please support these authors and Powell's by purchasing a copy of this book from us. A link to buy Our Country Friends will be shared in the chat a couple of times during this event. So Gary and Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you.
Hi, Gary. It's great to see you over the Zoom.
Great to see you, my fellow upstater. How are you?
Well, I have been busy rereading Our Country Friends, which I think is out in paperback today. Is that right?
Yeah, look at this. Oh my God. I love a good paperback. It's so soft, you know.
And what does that medallion say on it?
The medallion says, one of the New York Times notable books of the year. How about that?
And the hardcover says, quote, a masterpiece, end quote, by Andrew Sean Greer.
Who are all these nice people giving me all this stuff? Oh my God. Wow.
I'm sure that there are people who owe you good blurbs.
That's true. I've blurbed over 500 books. So people owe me a lot. Yeah.
So so this is a book about Sasha Senderovsky, who is a Jewish Russian writer who gets a place in upstate New York that he calls his dacha. Dacha, thank you. And invites he lives there with his wife, Masha, and their child, Nat or Natasha. And he invites his best friends to spend the pandemic with them. And you were working on this. You started this, I assume, in 2020.
Yeah, I was writing a kind of a dystopian novel set in New York City, not upstate, where NYU, New York University, which has already expanded all over my neighborhood in the city, but it decides to take over all of Manhattan and just pushes everyone out, creates its own police force. NYU becomes the only game in town, which kind of is true in like about the 10 square blocks where I live downtown. So it was like an academic satire, you know, haha. But then the pandemic started and I was like, I write about this kind of dystopia when I can write about the real dystopia. So by that point, I was already hunkered down upstate. And I spent about 6 months out of the year in a good year. But this time I just stayed on and was reading a lot of Chekhov because that's what you do in the country. Having a lot of drinks, but not too many drinks, which also helped a lot because I think in my usual kind of schedule of writing and going out, the going out can take over things, you know, but it was the pandemic, it was the country. In the countryside, our idea of a crazy party is like going on until 8 p.m. You know, that's considered in country time, that's like, wow. So I would go to bed early and rise early. And I was able to write this book faster than any other book I've ever written because it was the pandemic. So pandemics are good for writers, you know.
As many writers in the past prove to us. But wait, when you had any fear when you were working on it that the idea of the pandemic would be like old hat by the time it made it all the way into people's hands?
I didn't have that feeling. I thought that given the response of our former leader, who was then in charge, that this thing would just not work out. The problem wouldn't be cured with sunlight or bleach in 3 months. That rather it would continue for a very long time. And also that the country and the world in general, but our country in particular, was just not suited for a quick emergency response. So I thought that the virus would continue on for a while. And if you look through history, these viruses don't go away in a year, they hang around. But it was also this exciting time as a writer, not as a citizen of the planet, but it was an exciting time to see what people were like when they were stripped of social contact, when we were able to turn inside ourselves. The conceit of the book, of course, is that 6 or 7 people show up at Sasha Senderovsky's house, and there they actually have a friend named Sasha Senderovich, and I used his name at first, and he was like, "Please don't do that." So I changed it to Sasha Senderovsky from Senderovich. But it's weird because now I'm reviewing the book by Sasha Senderovich. He's a scholar for another publication, so it's all muddled in my head. Anyway, let's just call him Sasha. Sasha invites 8 people to his house, and I didn't quite have that situation, but I did form very tight bonds with some of my best friends upstate. And we spent a lot of our time hanging around by the pool, but kind of all separated across the pool and kind of shouting at each other. But it was really kind of sweet. I know obviously a lot of people had much worse encounters with the pandemic, but for us, it was very idyllic. And like I said, it's good for a writer to stay off the hooch and focus on her work.
But you do have, there's wine. Sasha drinks plenty, and his errand of like fetching wine at the beginning of the book is sort of like battening down the hatches for this pandemic that might last forever. And there's wine on the cover, and I see that you have wine behind you. Did somebody make Our Country Friends wine?
It's hard to find these, but this is Our Country Friends, the wine. It's a frisky little Riesling from Millbrook, which is Millbrook Wine is a winery upstate. I encourage anyone to try to find one. It's okay. It's pretty good. We had a couple of readings upstate, and we served those. And then we had a reporter from the Times came to the house to do an article, and we got her appropriately drunk on that. So which really helped the review. So yeah. We've had some fun with that. So many writers I know have left New York, have given up on living in New York because it's, they tried Brooklyn. Now Brooklyn is more expensive than Manhattan. The Queens, they're being thrown out of. The Bronx is getting there, but not there yet. Staten Island it's in Staten Island. So many people I know have left many writers specifically have left for sort of Rhinebeck, Kingston, where I know you are, Hudson, all that kind of stuff. So I know that when you go out on the streets of Kingston, there's a writer on every block. I was trying to get my license renewed, and this woman came out with a bullhorn and said, "If you're from Brooklyn, go home."
Trying to get your license renewed in Kingston?
Yeah, I know. This is during the height of the pandemic because all these Brooklynites had fled up there, and they were all told to go home. And I was like, "Yes, I actually am from here. That's what it says on my license." So I felt very much.
One of the things that your book sort of talks about is sort of maps out the different cultures of upstate. Sasha's place is next to like a sheep farm. So there's always, it's rather bucolic, like his view is very bucolic. But if you go down the road in one direction there, he starts to see, or his guests start to slowly see, that there's a kind of social unrest burbling inside. And you don't use the word Trump or Trumpism, but there's certain kind of flags that are emerging in iconography.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. When you walk down our street, so the congressional district I belong to is traditionally known as a very purple district. In fact, it's it was rated as, I think, one of the top 3 or 4 most purple districts out there, meaning that the combination of people is very, is almost perfectly diverse between the two parties. But so when you walk down our street, you'll see newcomers who will have their hate has no flag, hate has no home here sign next to their celebrate Juneteenth sign and all that kind of stuff. And then a few doors down, you'll see a Blue Lives Matter flag. And it's like, what? You know, so it's a very interesting kind of place. And we kind of do get along. There's not, you know, I mean, we're all very friendly, and nobody talks about their flags, you know, or their signs. But it's kind of an interesting social experiment almost, the fact that we're so, but we are able to see life like that up close, because I think living where I live in Manhattan, I mean, I don't think I've ever met a Republican on the streets. I know they're out there because we have, you know, the financial industry, so they're somewhere out there. But I haven't met one in the wild yet, you know. But in upstate, that's something that happens a bit. So it obviously it kind of went into the book. And also remember, I was reading a lot of Chekhov as I was starting the book, and the tonality of the book, I think, is very Chekhovian, as many reviewers noted. And I think that country life is what Chekhov is so obsessed about, because, you know, so many of his best stories and his best plays, Uncle Vanya plays a role in this, but so many of the best stuff he's ever written, it follows the kind of format where a bunch of people show up in the country, they're in their 40s, which is like their 60s in America, because people didn't live that long, especially in Russia. Well, even today, they don't live that long. So they would show up there and they would just complain about their lives. You know, it would be a short story or a play about regret, adult regret. And I just turned 50. I was 49 or 48 when I wrote the novel, or most of the novel. But I just turned 50, which again, I'm like shocked that I made it this far. And so I kind of felt like, yeah, when my friends get together, we all look back. And a lot of my friends are just like people in the book, of immigrant stock from all these different places. And we all went to this nerdy math and science high school in New York called Stuyvesant High School. So obviously I used a lot of things from my own background, but yeah, it's interesting how people at this stage are kind of just looking back, and sort of, few of us are having the traditional midlife crisis. You know, I haven't bought a Porsche or anything like that, although maybe I should, but no. But, you know, so it's a, I mean, at first, a lot of the books I wrote as a young person were sort of books of coming of age, which I think everyone does when you're in your 20s and 30s. There's excitement, obviously, about that. But at this stage, it's more like looking back, regrets, romances that didn't work out, romances that did, all of these taking stock kind of things that does feel to me very Chekhovian.
So I want to ask you about Masha, who, as Sasha's wife, is sort of the most consistent breadwinner, and is the one who's the most worried about the pandemic, and is the most careful about making sure people socially distance, and the most anxious about the state of their child, and ends up sort of being like she has to be the heavy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was actually riffing off something that my generation, again, as I said, I was born in 72, so I think I'm sort of prime Gen X, right? Prime Gen X, and I mean, many of my friends, the friendships are interesting. They're the ones that are coupled up and especially have children. It's the women are more than not the breadwinners and the heavies, except unfortunately it's almost like women in the Soviet Union both had heavy duty jobs and did a lot of the family functions. So, you know, I guess, and that's something that I kind of almost poke fun at, the fact that Sasha is the traditional landowner in Russian literature. He runs around wearing this sort of, you know, dressing gown all the time, and his wife both takes care of their child and is the one that has a real job. She's a psychiatrist, so she does Zoom consultations with her completely crazy MAGA Russian clients. So that's something I've been noticing in friendships, in relationships of my generation, and I kind of wanted to put that in there. In fact, the most successful person, the only sort of billionaire person in the book, is a woman named Karen Cho, who's a Korean-American billionaire who created an app that makes people fall in love with each other, which in the book functions almost like, you know, if you had a Shakespeare play like A Midsummer's Night Dream, that would be the love potion, but today it would be obviously brought up to date with an app instead of a love potion.
Yes, so the early on in the book, the one of the other guests. The guests are sitting around having a wonderful dinner, and I have to say, rereading this book made me like laugh, and it made me like forlorn, and it made me really hungry. And
yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, it's funny you say that, because we all became obsessed with food during the pandemic. And because it was one of the few pleasures that you could still sort of enjoy. I know that people who remained in New York obviously lived off of the best restaurants and other urban areas as well. But upstate, we just, we shopped at these grocery stores, and the people that would come over, we would have these potluck dinners, and people would make these incredible, there's a recipe for vitello tonato in this book that I think is worth the price of the book. Honestly, it's the best part of the book is this incredible vitello tonato, this Italian dish that's created over green string beans. And a friend of mine made that for us. So there's just, it really made you, the pandemic really made you hunger for sensual pleasure. And I think the book carries that through with several things. One, of course, is, yes, like you mentioned, the salivating, hunger-inducing parts of it. Everyone I know was making bread at that point, and some of the breads got pretty good. And the other part, I think, is physical. There's, I think all my books have a lot of sex, but this one also has a pretty decent amount, given that there's sort of 4 or 5 single people and they're all coupling up. So there's the opportunity for some interesting sex involved, including sex with masks, because remember, this is peak COVID, and I thought that was, I still haven't seen anyone else do that to this point. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I think masked sex did not appear in as many books as I thought it would be, and because a lot of my single friends were telling me they were going down that route. So yeah.
I feel like there was a dirty pun in there that I am just going to try to walk right by.
I know, as I was saying it, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to blush. I'm just going to.
So while they're sitting around at the table at this dinner, somebody jokingly pulls out Karen's app and uses it on 2 of the guests who are single and not coupled up.
Right.
And it's the actor who is referred to as the actor almost entirely through. And Dee, who is one of Sasha's sort of star / obnoxious students who, star / sassy student. What adjective should I use for Dee?
She self-identifies as provocative. She's very provocative. So
the 2 of them get put in the app, and just like Shakespeare with a love potion, the actor, who is famous and handsome and older, completely falls for Dee, and she just could not care less.
Yeah, right, because the app isn't working on her end of it. Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of my reaction to, I teach creative writing at Columbia at the graduate level. So a lot of my students are in their early 20s. And I haven't read they submit short stories or parts of novels. I haven't read a short story or a novel that isn't based on a date. If there's a date, it hasn't been based on, it hasn't taken place outside of Tinder or Hinge or Sponge or whatever these things are called, all these apps. In my day, obviously, Gen X, you met someone at a bar, then you'd wake up at some strange part of town, then you'd go to brunch with their friends, and then 20 years later you get married. That's how we did relationships. But for these young people, it's all Tinder and Hinder and all this stuff. And so I wanted the app to be a kind of stand-in for the fact that now when somebody chooses, who you're going to date, it's really one of these. It's an algorithm that's inside the machine that says, oh, you like trout fishing, sodas, etc. And I know that, I know that you can't put the donkey, the tail back on the donkey. It's, we are where we are, but I just wanted to emphasize that so many of our relationships, or especially for people I know who are younger, are mediated by algorithms, by machines, by artificial intelligence. So I kind of wanted to put that into the book. And also I wanted to have a funny kind of change of roles. So there's an actor who is known as the most attractive actor in the world. And so many people have had so much fun guessing who he is. most people have guessed wrong. I just did a book tour in Germany with like, yeah, I think it is, you know, and I'm like, no. But
Okay, so
I
being
can't.
Gen X, like you have been you've been on the tour with this is now the paperback.
Yeah.
So being Gen X, my assumption was like the first person that I pictured was Hugh Grant because he's handsome and he has floppy hair and he's a little bit self-deprecating, you know, like I could see him
I can see
working
that.
with.
That's not bad. Actually, no one's made that guess, and that's not bad. I have to say that's pretty good. Yeah.
But I wonder what were the most common guesses, or some of the most outrageous guesses.
Well, a lot of people think, and they're not entirely wrong, but a lot of people think that because I've done things with James Franco, who's sort of a friend, and Ben Stiller, that those are the actor. But I would say that in the end, there's maybe one person that's more the actor than anyone. But because I do a lot of work in TV and I've met a lot of actors, like there's common traits that I love to gather from everyone I know, which is what I do with anything, you know, with any project. If I'm going to have a sort of archetype for someone, I wrote a book, Lake Success, which was all about hedge funders, and I think I spent like 4 years hanging out with probably three dozen hedge fund writers. Yeah, Powell Books asked Brad Pitt. No, not even remotely. Shame on you, Powell's. But the funny thing I try to do in the book is because the algorithm works on the actor who normally wouldn't be falling in love with anyone. And D, we would think that D would fall in love with the actor because he's just so lovable. But the opposite thing happens because of the algorithm. And at first, D has absolutely no interest in the actor. In fact, the fact that the actor is in love with her because of this love potion kind of turns her off. She doesn't, you know, she's one of these people that does not want anyone to be in love with her, does not find that sexy at all. So it was fun for me to play around with this idea that this relationship is going to be tilted in a way that we didn't expect.
And so I was sort of wondering, because I don't think I'm going to give away, like there's a lot of sex. There's masturbation, there's sex between couples, people who are coupled up, there's sex between people who are not coupled up. There are, you know, the couple, everything moves around a little bit. And I was wondering if you were sort of you were giving Masha a gift of letting her fool around with the actor, because I hope I'm not giving away too much by saying that does end up happening.
Yeah, there is I think it happens about 80 pages into the book. I always think that, you know, you can't have 80 pages in a book without anyone having sex. Then, you know, the whole book just falls apart. But maybe it's because I'm, again, old school Gen X, where, you know, I grew up in a time when people actually had live sex instead of, you know, digital or whatever you call it these days. But, you know, for me, it was important to give her some out because she's in this very stifling relationship with this kind of clueless. And the reason Sasha invites the actor over is because he's running out of money. He needs the money to keep his estate going, which is a very Chekhovian concern, you know, very, you know, cherry orchard kind of stuff. He needs the money to keep it going, and the only way he can get the money is by making this the pilot of the show that he's making with the actor based on one of his books, Come Alive. But Masha is completely abandoned in many ways because Sasha is so concerned with his stature and his career and keeping the bungalow going, and also his relationship with his friends, that he misses out on his relationship with his actual living wife and also their child and so many other things. And so there is very quickly in the book a kind of act of not just revenge. I mean, I think she really enjoys her dalliance with the actor. I mean, who wouldn't, you know? He's the actor.
So you say that you've mentioned Chekhov several times.
Sorry, stop now. Last Chekhov reference.
What?
Last Chekhov reference. It's been compared to The Big Chill too. So you have that. It's Chekhov.
No, I was curious about like operating within the bounds of, you've talked about reading about suffering, like that you enjoy suffering. And is that something that's characteristic of Chekhov, is the character suffering?
The suffering, I mean, you know, every character, especially at this point in their life, is confounded with the fact that they never quite did what they thought they would do as young people, you know. Now, Chekhov has a very wry sense of humor. A lot of this stuff is very funny. It's even funnier in Russian, I would have to say. But there's little foibles that each of the character has. And to me, humor is the fact that we always kind of mistake who we are, especially when we are younger. I may think I'm a giraffe, but I'm actually a groundhog. There's that kind of big, I think I'm this tall, glorious creature, but I'm really this small marmot running around. And I think that kind of difference between expectations makes for humorous literature. But there's a different kind of tragedy in writing the same kind of stuff from characters who are, 48, 49, 50, because at this point, if you still think you're a giraffe, you're in deep trouble. You really should have learned to live as a marmot by this point, or have done enough exercises to stretch your neck out to become a giraffe. It's sort of one of the two. But the first option, I think, is the best. And the other part of this is that all these characters are immigrants growing up in America. So they've all had parents beating the crap out of them for, getting 98% on a report card instead of the full 100. So they all share, and I share this trait as well, being an immigrant from Russia, they all share this kind of incredible competitiveness, which of course carries over into competitiveness with each other, much the same way they were competing in high school. So, and that creates for me, look, as a writer, and I say this to my students at Columbia, tension, tension, tension. All you're trying to do is find points of tension. If everyone is happy and loves each other and is content and has a great 401k plan, I don't want to read that book, awful. I want to live that life, but I don't want to read that book.
So one of the driving forces, one of the sort of maybe sub forces of the plot. I mean, the driving force of the plot is there's a pandemic. These are people of relative privilege who are in a safe, basically safe and immune from the worst of what's happening around them, but still subject to, like you say, all of the travails of being middle-aged in America and not being a giraffe. But one of the pieces of the plot is that the writer, Sasha, has betrayed at least one of his friends, and betrayal sort of by not telling him, by telling him something a long time ago that he probably shouldn't have.
Yeah. I mean, that is to me fascinating, the way so many friendships are based, the fulcrum of them is a kind of lie that doesn't get exposed. And in many cases, I think we almost know what the lie is. But I think just the same way that our relationships with our significant others, and more importantly with our parents, and sometimes also with young children, you don't want to say to a 5-year-old, hey, I think the planet's going to end in 5 years, so enjoy your time in this world. There's some kind of lie, but here the lie is exacerbated because it was a betrayal that significantly affected the career, the literary career, or non-career, I should say, of one of these people. It was an act of sabotage. And that also is based on, I'm one of these writers that never really uses an imagination, because thankfully there have been so many interesting things that have happened. And, I remember I wrote Super Sad True Love Story, which I think ended up being I see a copy behind you. It ended up being thank you for that purchase, being one of my probably best-selling and most cited books. But a friend of mine who is another writer of some esteem read it and said, you can't publish this book, it'll destroy your career. And because I showed him an early draft of it. And for a second, I called my agent, I was almost in tears. I said, maybe we should not send this book out. And then she said, are you crazy? And then my editor said that, and just, I had to be talked down from the ledge, because I really thought that, and it took a long time to write that book because it took a lot of research and stuff. And so I was very despondent. But then everyone else said, your friend is just not giving you good advice. So that experience kind of created this idea that I could do that with these characters, with two of the characters in this book. And it was a little rough to write, because I think the character who carries that through is the one that's most aligned to me personally, the Sasha character. But if you're writing things that are comfortable, you probably shouldn't be writing them,
So Sasha has quit teaching.
Yeah.
But you and is just relying on the very fickle world of TV to work out. But you teach. Is there any relationship between what's the creative relationship between teaching in the classroom and the work that you're doing on your own fiction?
So I mean, I have a very nice arrangement where I only teach in the spring. So I teach one semester, so 4 months, and then 8 months I take off to recover from teaching, and then I do it again. I find it, I mean, I hate to use the cliche where people are like, I learn more from my students than they learn from me, but because that would be kind of sad if my students paid all that money and I was the one who got an education out of it. But no, of course, I'm hugely inspired by people who are in an earlier stage of the process. I got my first book deal from one of my professors when I was in grad school, and I try to do that for my students, and also try to, of course, I'll blurb the heck out of them because I blurb everyone. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, but I find it interesting. It gives me a connection to the world as it is now. I'm absolutely curious in how people think about everything from relationships to relationship with their parents to technology. All of that stuff comes through really nicely in creative writing. Almost all of the creative writing that we see in so-called literary fiction comes from people who have graduated from a Master of Fine Arts program. So whether we like that or not, it's become a kind of strange gatekeeper. Sometimes for the worse, I will definitely admit that, but in many cases for the better. So, and also, like Sasha in the book, I have alcohol in my class. It's a graduate program, and I allow people to bring in wine and whiskey and stuff like that. And I think that really helps. It gives it a more kind of Gertrude Stein, Hemingway, Parisian feel. Everyone's a little drunk. We bring in snacks. I wish we could have oysters like in Paris, but there's a really good pizza shop down the streets. Pizza, oysters. So we have a really good time, I think. The evaluations always say, that was a lot of fun. I didn't learn anything, but that was fun. No, okay.
So, like you put an actor in, you put a student, like there's a character in the novel who's a student who comes up and is one of the people who stays at the house, which, were you troubled at all? Like, did any of your students read this and be like, whoa, you're gonna characterize us that way? Or like, did you get any feedback?
No, I think people think Dee is kind of badass. I think that kind of character is, well, also, and to make, Dee is, she writes essays, so she's in the nonfiction department, but I sometimes have nonfiction students in my seminar and they are pretty badass. I think but I do notice that there you have to be kind of almost even louder than in fiction, which has its own ways and byways, but in nonfiction, you really have to pop up and be loud, not just on the page, but also on Twitter. And so that becomes a major plot point in the book and I love doing this. And I've been getting some nice feedback on this from people about, so there's a cancellation that happens in the book, and it's sort of carried through on Twitter. And a lot of people I know during the pandemic, the people that I've known for a while, sort of got canceled. I mean, it's not like they lost their livelihood or anything, but there was like a storm against them and people were piling on and stuff like that. So it was kind of, and we were all so bored. There was, life was so dull during the pandemic that even a Twitter cancellation was like, oh, popcorn time, yum, yum, And so I had a lot of fun kind of writing that, and people were just, I think it was the Times or the Washington Post was commending my portrayal of the way cancellations take place in real time. Because that's the other thing, is it happens so fast, it just snowballs, Sometimes people try to cancel me from the far right and stuff like that, but it's so boring because it doesn't really have any effect on me. Like, but I'm going to get fired from Columbia because a bunch of Nazis are angry. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. But for Dee, there are real consequences for what happens.
So I was wondering, I mean, I had written down a question to ask about the role of naming in your books. And then because my brain is very bad at remembering character names, I was writing them all down. And I wrote down Dee's name, and Dee's last name is Cameron. And it wasn't until I saw it put down with my own hands after having read your book twice that it's Decameron. You named her Decameron, like the Decameron.
Yeah, just like the Decameron. Yeah, it was one of my sort of for literary nerds. It was my little a little amuse-bouche for the literary nerds. Yeah. Yeah.
Were there others that I missed, and other
That's the one. I know I see someone in the Q&A asked what were the influences, and I would say, yeah, that the Cameron was, I was rereading it towards the beginning of the pandemic, not even knowing that I was going to do this book, but, and I remember, I mean, I read it, I don't know, in college, but what I kind of forgot was just how raunchy that thing is. I mean, it's a very long book, but you know, they're Italians, they're Florentines, which is sort of like being a New Yorker or a Londoner back then. And they're fleeing they're fleeing Florence for this abandoned estate. And there's like, they tell these tales, and I think one of the first tales is this raunchy monk who has sex with young girls. I mean, it's like, today you can cancel for writing that, right? But yeah, I really got in the spirit of things by reading that, because it was, it was this strange thing, right? So they fled the city, and back in Florence, everyone's dying of the plague, and here they are, and uncorking these nice wines and having these fantastic conversations deep into the night, and that was sort of the spirit of our country friends.
Yeah. So we've had a couple of questions. I'm going to start going to questions in a second. But I wanted to start with one general one, which I think some people have sort of asked, which is, you said that you can't go back to Russia for political reasons. I wonder if you could talk about that, and if you want to talk about at all about Russia, Ukraine, because it's such a huge change in our landscape.
No, it's just so sad. And yeah, I've been sort of barred from Russia because I've written a lot of anti-Putin things, and I was stopped at the airport here once and told, your visa is no longer valid. No, it's a horrifying thing. I mean, two of my grandparents were born in Ukraine, so in a sense, I'm also Ukrainian. And my grandfather was born in Ukraine, moved up to Leningrad, and fought in World War II, and was killed defending Leningrad from the Germans, from the Nazis, and during the siege of Leningrad. So he was a Ukrainian who moved to Leningrad to defend, the future Putin, who grew up in Leningrad in the 50s, right? Who became a fascist himself. The sort of circularity of that is intense. Yeah, this may be the time for people to put that, I'm sort of doing American literature, but in terms of Russian literature, I'm asking people to, if you're going to read a Russian book, maybe substitute it right now with some great Ukrainian literature. As somebody who works with PEN International, the wonderful free speech nonprofit, I welcomed Andrei Kurkov, Kurkov, I think in English, who is an amazing Ukrainian writer. His last book is Gray Bees. He's also known for the Penguin series, Death and the Penguin, etc. But the last book is very interesting because it's set after the invasion in 2014, but before the current Russian attack against Ukraine. So it's sort of in that gray zone between the two, and it's a really fascinating read. I really recommend it. So, a nightmare. On Twitter, we've been having a long debate about this, because I have friends in Russia who are obviously aghast about the war. They can't do anything because even saying there is a war will land them in prison for 15 years. And I don't want to sort of privilege them because there are actual people dying in Ukraine, and having horrible things happen. But at the same time, it's this is a tragedy for everyone involved. But of course, for Ukraine, but there is going to be a silver lining to this for Ukraine, not for Russia. Russia will always be a disaster. But in Russia, I think the silver lining for Ukraine, the silver lining will be that the country will finally be welcomed by Europe. By the European Union, maybe by some kind of security structure, but just the fact that it will be hopefully rebuilt by the EU at one point and will have to change some of its own politics to accommodate EU values, I think is going to be so exciting for Ukraine. And whenever I've been to Ukraine, I've just felt so free. It's a country where in Kyiv, most people speak Russian. Nowadays, that's changing and becoming more Ukrainians are speaking, more people are speaking Ukrainian, obviously, but it was one of the first times in my life where I've heard Russian spoken all around me, but I was in a free country. I don't think that's ever happened to me. Certainly when I was allowed in Russia, that wasn't the case. But it's been, it's been really horrifying to see death for no reason whatsoever. just one man's insanity. But also, I should say, one man's insanity, but also backed by tens of millions of Russians who have developed no democratic instincts since the fall of the Soviet Union. Absolutely none. Who sit there, watch state television, and just believe what they're told. Right? Well,
That
maybe
sounds like
sounds like us. I know.
so
I have relatives who watch both Russian state TV and Fox, and who haven't been vaccinated yet, because both things tell them not to do it,
So I think this connects a little bit. I understand that this week I'm trying to connect three questions at once. That the Russian newspaper, which was one of the two news outlets that won the Nobel Prize last year, has been shut down. They lost their permit to publish. Sorry?
Yeah, I just said the name of it. Yeah.
What is it called?
Novaya Gazeta.
Oh, like
New newspaper.
Newspaper.
Right.
You know what? It was a free place in my college Russian classes where everybody around me spoke Russian, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. So somebody said, "Love all your books. Are you expecting to get a Nobel?"
Please. Every time I win like the National Jewish Book Award of Bergen County, I'm like, wow, that's nice. But I think in my generation, the Nobel goes to some weird people. In my generation, everyone just wants an Emmy. So that's my dream, that's my LA dream, to just win an Emmy for something one day. I won some award. I did some work on Succession. It wasn't an Emmy, it was the Writers Guild Award or something like that. That felt really nice. That felt like,
You worked on Succession?
yeah, of course. I mean,
Can you? What do you mean, of course?
Oh God, yeah. I think everyone's worked on that. Well, that has a very literary bent, Succession. Yeah, that was wonderful. I was just on the set for the next season. No spoilers, but great show. So much of TV now is really interesting to me because it kind of reminds me of books. I think a lot of TV has taken on a lot of what novels are, and because they're more episodic, meaning that there's a kind of chapter-like structure as opposed to something new happening all the time. I mean, I think shows like The Sopranos obviously pioneered that, but that's been carried through very interestingly. It almost does feel like the ability to dip into a book, especially because now so much of it is streamed, 10 episodes at a time, the way you would read 10 chapters at a time of a novel. So for me, there's a lot of wonderful kind of parallels between contemporary television, not Gilligan's Island or whatever we had growing up, and the novel.
Okay. All right. I want to ask you, somebody has asked a couple of deep questions about Our Country Friends, so I want to sort of read those. Is that okay?
Yeah, is this by David? Yeah. Of the San Diego Shteyngarts?
Yes.
I love that. Yeah. So in San Diego, they have this group called the Shteyngart, and they're just incredible people. I love them. I did a reading once in San Diego, and they came out, and I blessed this sweet potato fry, which I think they hopefully still keep, but they put it in a thing. They're just a wonderful people. Thank you, Shteyngarts. Yeah.
So he's curious about A, how the app works in practical terms, and B, mentions that towards the end there is a dramatic change in style for some of the scenes, and if you could explain some of the decisions that went into writing in that form.
Yeah, let me get to that question because it's kind of interesting. There are, without giving too much away, a character goes through a bunch of hallucinations. And so what happened to me was that toward the end of writing the first draft of this book, I experienced a rather insane medical problem, which you can read about in the New Yorker. Just Google Shteyngart and botched circumcision, and you'll have a great time. But for this truly horrific medical emergency, I was prescribed a bunch of drugs, many of which had a kind of almost, I wouldn't say psychedelic, but it had, so I would take the drug at night before going to bed, and then I'd wake up and I would be having hallucinations for hours. Many of them were very scary. Weirdly enough, a friend of mine was recently on a ventilator and had very similar experiences. But anyway, once the hallucinations ended around 4 p.m., I would quickly type them down, and they sort of became a part of the novel when the character begins to experience hallucinations. So that accounts, I think, for some of the somewhat disjointed, so the Chekhovian kind of pastoral tone that exists before that gradually gives way to at least a chapter, I think. I don't remember how long it is, but maybe 20 pages or so of a very different kind of writing, because it's almost a first person experience of this kind of, when your mind really becomes unmoored and you kind of leave
Yeah, it's like
this astral plane. Mm-hmm.
It's like a nightmare dreamscape. Yeah, sort of.
And I see that they still have the fry. Thank you for keeping that fry. If I ever go back to San Diego, and I hope that happens, I would love to bless other food too.
We have another question, and it is, what do you think's the best way to counter school boards? You're involved in Penn, and school boards being challenged on these very Susan, thank you for this question, on these very bad faith charges. Sometimes it's about Jewish books, sometimes it's about LGBTQ books.
The worst of it was, I think there was a board that was like, well, we have to teach both perspectives of the Holocaust. We got to. The Nazis had important points to make too. Why are we leaving them out of the conversation? It's interesting. And we were talking about Russia and Ukraine, and the kind of censorship that happens in Russia is exactly on the same line. So there's a kind of far right insanity that often comes out of Russia almost. I mean, that's a kind of, that country has been very influential in supporting the far right movements across Europe, but also in the United States. This idea that one can control the truth. I mean, what is the line from 1984? He who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future. So the idea that if you disallow certain things from children's purview, they will grow up never knowing that there is something like the Handmaid's Tale, which can make them become more wary when, say, reproductive freedoms are being taken away. What can we do? Well, since I've been living upstate in this very purple district, what I realized, especially for my friends who send their kids to school up there, is that nothing matters more than these elections, school board elections. Probably school board elections, I would say, may be the most important elections out there, because they really are key to, and it's interesting, right? Because in the last election, I think we actually the Democratic candidate, Paul Ryan, won against the Republican in what for us would be considered a landslide, something like 61% versus 39%. And he very smartly tied in his campaign with reproductive freedom, right? So that galvanized a lot of people to come to the polls. But even though we've been winning in that sense, we have been losing when there's school board elections and where these kinds of issues, vaccine, masking, et cetera, comes up. They're able to get more people to the polls. They're able to get their side more interested in these issues than those of us who oppose, censorship or back in the height of COVID, lackadaisical attitudes toward COVID. So it's interesting how the most important thing you can probably do is vote in very local elections, state elections for state legislature, but even more so, I would think, school board and library board elections for sure.
Okay, I'm sorry, my cat just marched up and was meowing very loudly, and I was trying to mute it without making too much of a racket.
Yeah.
I think that's all the questions, but I wanted to ask you about something random that I saw. So I know that you have fans who know a lot about watches.
Yeah.
And then I also saw that you were interviewed by Fred Savage, who is an actor, who was a child actor and is now a director and works all the time in Hollywood. And that he talked to you about this book. Yeah. And do you guys have watches in common? How do you know Fred?
This is very strange. So I fell in love with watches because I needed a hobby, especially as the world sort of started falling apart. I thought I really need something to do. And watches I mean, I hate watches as kind of status symbols, but there's a lot of weird stuff about them, and they form a strange culture. Fred Savage is one of these people, but there's a whole undercurrent, especially a lot of people in Hollywood, people who kind of meet secretly. There's these secret watch meetings in New York and LA where nobody even knows about them because, you know, somebody could break in and steal all our watches. But you go to it's like a speakeasy, and you show up and you kind of, you know, show each other your watches. And but a lot, I mean, I'm not going to sort of out anyone who does, you know, some people want to keep it secret, but there's a whole underground of watches. And for me, they're also like, they're a weird way for men who don't know how to communicate, but don't really care about sports like me. Like I can't walk into a room and if everyone's talking about the Dodgers versus the Pirates or whatever, and the Giants, you know, I don't know what's going on, but I can walk in and say the reference number of a watch, and these watch nerds will, you know. So I think for those of us who are shy, especially you know, growing up, I most of my friends were women, and as I reach my 50s, I'm like, well, what are men like? You know, I may as well check them out too. But that means having some kind of weird, pointless hobby to substitute for a lack of emotions, and that to me means watches. But you know, maybe sports. I'll try sports next. Yeah.
So now we're doing this event on Zoom, and I wonder what if you were able to do live events after Our Country Friends came out, and do you miss them?
I've done a couple. Yeah, I'm doing one tomorrow in New York. If anyone's around New York, it's a new store called P&J Knitwear. It's an old knitting store, but it's on the Lower East Side, 200 Orchard Street. Anyway, I love live events. I mean, I hope we've had some fun tonight. But you know, readers are amazing. They've sustained me for 20 crazy years. It's been 20 years since my first book popped out, Russian Debutantes, something or other. And, you know, those have been 20, obviously, the best years of my life. But being able to connect to readers, and I've been extending this thing that I've been doing, you know, with my classes where we all have some drinks. And I just, after reading's over, you know, people are signing books, and people say, hey, you want to go out to the local bar? Unless I'm flying out 4 o'clock the next day, you know, I'll say, sure, let's do it. I mean, you know, if someone's wearing Viking horns or something, I'll be a little afraid, but most people are very nice. And so I've been trying very much to go out with them. The way I went out with the Shteyngarts in San Diego, that was a very, very nice time. Yeah.
Okay, great. I have one last question. I know you've been asked this a lot about the influences on the book. Had you read Camus' The Plague?
Yeah, no, I mean, I read it when I was in college, but I haven't read it since. And I know that would have obviously made a very nice segue. Yeah, it kind of makes, I was trying to balance out the obvious things to read for this, including the Journal of a Plague Year, etc. In reading the Decameron, I thought I had captured the more kind of fun and lusty approach to pandemics. But one thing that happens is, and it happened to me, is that the characters in my book are having the times of their lives, but because they grew up in Queens, which was the epicenter of the pandemic at that point, and a lot of, if they, you know, if all of us had come 20 years later than we did, we would all be living there now. And so there was a kind of need to balance the sadness of Camus, but also with the kind of fun approach of the Decameron. So the book contains both of that. And that's, you know, when I think about, you know, my first book came out 20 years ago, all I've been trying to do for these 6 books, and I plan to write 6 more books. I want to do 12, and then I can die. All I want to do is to continue to create the right balance between the humor and pathos, because the older I get, obviously, the more I experience the latter, but the more I also desperately need the former. And I think that's true of all of us, both readers and writers alike. You know, the world is only getting more complex and more sad, and I turn to that kind of Russian or Ukrainian Jewish humor which is this kind of humor from the edge of the grave. That's what's important to me as I sail full on into my future.
Okay, I know we're almost done. I want to say that you totally do capture that in Our Country Friends. And I was reminded, sometimes when we're experiencing something negative and difficult in the world, like all I want to do is pile on reading that reflects that. And Our Country Friends was about the pandemic, but it was so delightful, and reading it again, it's really it's just really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like, if it was just the pandemic, that would become kind of dull. And I wanted to really write a novel about friendship, but happened to be set in that adventurous year, 2020.
And before we go, I want to ask you about what you have coming next. And I think that there was a project connected to your botched circumcision story,
Yeah.
which was it was what, 8,000 words?
8,000 words on circumcisions, yeah, or 9,000, I think. Yeah, it was a lot of words.
It was
I'm
literally painful to read.
funny, right? I mean, there's some
Not funny.
And so I actually wrote a one-man show about it, and we are slowly moving ahead with that. So for those of you living in the New York area, hopefully next year, I would hope, or at least, because a lot of these theaters are very backlogged with stuff that didn't happen with, they're still doing stuff that was supposed to happen during COVID. But I think it's okay. It's a one-man play, very kind of Spalding Gray. You heard it here first.
And who would perform it?
Me!
Wow.
Yeah. I'm very performant. Yeah. I only wish that I'd had a theater major at Oberlin instead of whatever it was. I majored in Gary studies or something. No.
Well, that's fantastic. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
Gary Shteyngart is going to be, on stage, soliloquizing.
Soliloquizing.
In 2024?
Maybe. We'll see. I don't know. It depends on their schedules. But
2023?
Yeah.
Well, it's been such a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for your fabulous book. Everybody go get it in paperback from the links that Powell's has given you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, Gary and Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to hear you both get to talk and all that kind of stuff, and hear about all your new projects and all that, Gary. Excellent. So thanks so much. And thank you for everyone out there for tuning in to this event. And go and purchase a copy of Our Country Friends. And while you're there, check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events, and we look forward to seeing you at another one soon. So once again, thank you both, and everyone have a great day.
You too.